Hello and welcome to the fifth section on creating smart web apps with Django. In this section, we will learn all about writing tests and task management in Django. In the first video of this section, we'll learn about the Django test framework, and we will use it for writing and running our test cases. So let's get started. If you recall, when we had created our blog app, Django had created a file called test.py for us. This is the file where we will be writing all our test cases related to the blog app. However, before we move forward, let's take a quick look inside the views.py file. The first view we had written was the blog post view. Let's take a look at what it's doing at the moment. The blog post view accepts a GET request and returns all the blog post objects currently in the database. However, as part of the response, it only returns the ID, title, and author for each blog post. This information is returned in the response context when we make the call render to response. So let us now open the test.py file. As you can notice, Django has already imported the test case class for us. The test case class will be the base class for all our test cases. At first, we define a class called blogPostViewTest, which inherits from the test case class. This is the class that will be used to write all the test cases for our blog post view. In the first step, we define the setup method of the class. The setup method is responsible for setting up the initial test data for the test case. Make sure that the U in the setup is capital letter, as the name setup is camel cased. If you remember, our blog post view returns a list of blog post objects. To test our blog post view successfully, we would first need to create few test blog post objects, but before that we would need to create a user object. To do that, we import the user model from the django.contrib.auth.models module, and we make a call to user.objects.createUser. Here we do not create an object directly by calling objects.create, because the createUser function takes care of some user setup, for example hashing the password given in the input. So now it's time to give the parameters for the createUser function. And we set the username, email, and password for our test user. We would want to access the user object in our test cases, so let's set it as a class attribute by adding self before it. And now we will create a couple of blog post objects. For that, we have imported the blog post model from the blogs.models module. Creating a blog post is easy by adding the blog post.objects.create function call. Here we set the title, user, and body according to the specification of the blog post model. Let us create another object. The second object is very similar to the first one but has a different title and a different body. The user is the same. Also, when it is created, the second object will have a different ID than the first one. Along with the test case module, let's also import the client. The client is a helper utility that helps us set up a test client for our test cases. We create a client instance and assign it to self.client. Here, the client module handles the nitty-gritty details of sending a request and simulates the request sent by our browser. We also import the reverse function that helps us look up the URL via the name of a URL. We set the URL of the blog post view to self.url by using the name posts. This is the same as declared in the urls.py file earlier. And now finally we can start writing our test case. We name our function test_get as we want to test the GET request. It is important that a test case starts with the name test_. As part of the test, we simply call the self.client.get method with the self.url. Here, the client will send a GET request to the URL, which is the /posts URL, and we store the response returned by the GET request in the variable named response. If we've written our code correctly and configured the URLs properly, our response should be receiving a 200 status code. This can be inspected by looking at the response.status_code variable. So, our first test case will have an assert statement like this. Here, we are calling the assert equal function and passing it the response.status code and checking if it is equal to 200. This is a helper function that tests for the equality of the two parameters. Let us save this file and take a look at how to run this test. To run the test, we call python space manage.py space test and hit enter. The test case will be run after a test database is created, and finally we can see that our test has passed. It is important to note that Django automatically creates the database before the test cases are run and at the end deletes the database. This ensures that we get a fresh start each time we are running our test suite. However, our test case is not complete yet. As part of the test case, we also want to assert that the data returned was expected as written in our view. To test that, we will inspect the context data that we return as part of the render-to-response function call from our view. This can be tested by looking at the response.context_data variable. So let's store that data in a variable. The context is a dictionary, and in our view, we are passing the dictionary by setting the list of blog posts to the key posts. In this test case, we extract that by specifying the key to the context_data dictionary. And with that, we have stored the returned data in the variable named data. Here, data is a list of blog post objects. As you can see in the setup function, we've created two blog post objects, which means that the length of this data array should be 2. So let's add an assert statement for checking the length of the data array. Here, we are checking that the length of data which returns the length of the data array, and we are expecting it to be 2. Let us now write an assert statement for checking the contents of the data itself. Here, we check that the first element of the data contains the dictionary with ID 1, which would be the ID of the first blog post object, and the title test post 1. Similarly, we are also checking for the author field, which is expected to be the username of the user object we've created in our setup function. Similarly, we add a check for our second element of our data array. The only difference being the ID field and the title field. The author field is expected to be the same. Let's save this file and run our tests again. And you can see that our tests have passed. With that, we come to the end of this video. You can find out more about tests from the following link.